Hello, today I want to introduce you to the theory of functionalism, which is a theory in the philosophy of mind. Functionalism is usually considered the physicalist theory, although we'll see that that's actually, strictly speaking, not true. The key idea of functionalism is that we should understand the brain and brain states and sensations as functional. What does that mean? Well, the term function was brought into philosophy, specifically analytic philosophy, by a man called Gottlob Frege, who was a mathematician and logician. The term function is originally a mathematical term, and it's just a simple term for saying when you take a certain number, you can put it through a process and get an output. If I take the number 2, I can put it through the function of squared and get the outcome 4. So I have an input, number 2, output 4. The function is the squared. Then you can imagine that for the number 3. 3 squared is 9, for example. So the squared bit, that middle bit from taking the input and having the output, is the function. And functionalists really are saying something very simple, that that's what the brain does. The brain takes certain sensory inputs, like seeing an animal, like a bear. I see the bear, I see it coming towards me, and I take that, the brain and the organism that I am takes that input, and it thinks, I should run away. And I'm likely to behave in such a way as to run away from the bear. So there's the input, sensory inputs, and the outputs that are part of that. And what explains the relationship between those inputs and outputs is the function. It's the mind, and the mind does things. The best way for students to understand functionalism really, and I think the most obvious analogy, is with AI or with computers. If you think about computers, there is hardware, which you could think of very much as the chemical composition of the brain, and then the software, which is what happens, what that hardware does. And obviously, in the same way that you have different kinds of computers, you have different kinds of brains. And even though you have these different kinds of brains, there's the same software on them. And we're going to see that's a real strong advantage of functionalism. So one way of thinking of functionalism is to think, well, it's very much like the claim that computers are thinking things. It's not quite the same, but it's similar. It's a bit like saying human beings are organic organisms that are functionally like, let's say, computers. Hilary Putnam was the first person to develop functionalism. His form of functionalism is sometimes called empirical functionalism, and it really says something like we can explain human behaviour and beliefs by appeal to the functions of the brain. Later on, Armstrong comes up with something called causal role functionalism, which is similar. It understands the mind to be a function, but it says, look, the brain causes certain things to happen. So there's a slight difference between causation and explanation, which I'll leave to another video, and you don't have to worry about that distinction, but it's worth knowing that they exist. Well, the first advantage of functionalism is that it explains multiple realizability. If you remember back to mind-brain identity theory, which is the claim that a certain sensation of seeing yellow is the same as something happening right now in my brain, it's identical to a thing happening right now and here. The issue we had with that was, well, other animals can, for example, see the colour yellow or feel a sensation of pain, and other animals have different brains. So it can't be that the sensation of seeing yellow is an identical thing to my brain state now. And we looked at the issue of that in the previous video. Well, functionalism embraces that. And functionalism says, yes, absolutely. You do not need to have a specific brain and a particular thing happening in that brain for you to see the colour yellow. It could happen, it could be realised in different kinds of brains. Animal brains, possibly extraterrestrial organisms that might even have brains. So long as they have an organ which does the same thing, it takes an input, sensory experience, and produces an output, then we can say that those brains have the same mental states as we do. So that's a very strong advantage of functionalism because it allows for what's called multiple realizability. And it also explains why we can call, for example, an octopus's eye an eye, or a bird's eye an eye. They're different from our eyes. They're physiologically different, but they do the same thing. And so it makes perfect sense for us to call the thing an eye because it does what our eyes do. The second advantage of functionalism is it helps to override the issues that we have with behaviorism. And if you remember back to behaviorism either in its hard or in its soft form says something like that a mental state just either is a behaviour or it's a disposition to behave in certain ways. One of the problems behaviorism had was it couldn't explain the super Spartan thought experiment, which says we could imagine a group of people who never express their pain, who never show pain, who never talk about pain, but they experience it. Right? So if they experience it, but they never show it, there's something wrong with behaviorism. They never show it. And functionalism says, yes, it's true that sometimes our behaviour is overridden by other functions. So, for example, if I'm being chased by some dangerous people and I'm in pain and they're close by and I'm hiding, I might not express. I probably will not express my pain if I can avoid it because I don't want to be caught. So the fact that that pain isn't expressed is explained by it being overridden by another function, my desire to survive. Functionalism can make sense of that. It can say not all our inputs will be expressed in the same way, and not all of our inputs will necessarily lead to behavioural states. It does depend on what else is going on. So that's a good advantage we have there. The final advantage is that functionalism is pretty consistent with the theory of evolution. Now, although the theory of evolution does not say that we are designed in any way, it doesn't deny that there's functions. It doesn't deny that organisms do things. And one thing that happens in the theory of evolution, which is fascinating, is something called convergent evolution. So if we look at the Tasmanian wolf, which went extinct in Tasmania in about 1930, actually went extinct in Australia itself much earlier, that animal looked like a dog. It behaved like a dog, and you'd be hard pressed to see the difference between it and a dog. You'd actually have to look in at very specific parts of its skull to see the difference. But anyway, the Tasmanian wolf had nothing to do with a dog at all. It was a marsupial. So it was closer to kangaroos and koala bears than it was to dogs. And yet the Tasmanian wolf did the same thing as a dog. Why? Well, that's because it had very similar inputs and needed to have very similar outputs. It lived in a very similar environment to a dog. And so functionalism explains why convergent evolution happens. The reason convergent evolution happens is that in order to survive, you need to do certain things in certain environments. And that means very different kinds of species will converge in their properties and in their appearance properties and even in their functional properties, because that is how they survive. So functionalism is consistent with evolution. It makes better sense than behaviorism does, and it makes better sense than mind-brain identity theory does of the mind. So those are serious advantages that functionalism has, and so it is clearly in some ways much preferable to those theories. If you want to see the disadvantages of functionalism, please wait for the next video.